On this episode of Doing the Most, we're going to convert a subscriber's jam wine recipe into a mead.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
Many months ago, subscriber Michele sent in her jam wine recipes for a strawberry jam wine. And the question she posed was, how would I turn this into a jam mead recipe? So we went back and forth by email, and I decided that this was something that I could take on and something that I thought would be fun to share on the channel. So this is Michele's recipe. As you can see, she used several different additions of sugar in this recipe, 71B yeast, a little diammonium phosphate for nutrient, and some pectic enzyme in order to break down the cell walls of the strawberries. Michele step-fed this jam wine through a few different rackings, and she also racked it at one point onto a couple pounds of frozen and thawed strawberries. Additionally, she used a little bit of kiwi for a little extra flavor. So in converting this to become a mead, the first thing that I had to do was actually heft up the volume on this, because her recipe was, I think, for 2 or 2.5 gallons worth of wine. I wanted to go for a full 5-gallon batch, and so in doing so, I had to add more fermentable sugars as well as bulk up the quantity of both jam and frozen fruit in order to get the right fruit flavor out of this mead. I also changed the yeast choice on this because, as you've seen in previous videos, I don't really personally care for the yeast 71B. I don't really care for how it treats fruit and changes some of the character of the fruit during fermentation. I prefer a yeast that has a bit more predictable results. So let's take a look at my ingredients list. The ingredients for our strawberry jam mead are 11 pounds of strawberry jam, 8 pounds of honey, 6 grams of wine tannin, and water to 5 gallons. We're also going to be adding in some opti-red and pectic enzyme, and using Red Star's Premier Rouge red wine yeast. Then we're going to be racking on to 9 pounds of frozen strawberries for 2 weeks, and we will be finishing our mead by back sweetening with 2 cups of erythritol. So you may have seen an ingredient on that ingredients list that's not familiar to you. opti-red. It's not really something I've worked with either, but folks in the comment sections on our videos have asked from time to time if we're ever willing to work with it. So I had some just kicking around and hadn't really had an opportunity to use it much yet, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to put it into something that's bright red. opti-red improves body, color stability, and mouthfeel in red wines by making polysaccharides available to complex with polyphenols. And they recommend using this in tandem with a pectic enzyme, which we did. This is an all-natural product. It's made of yeast derivatives, and it's intended for use in wine or mead making. So I thought, since we're dealing with something that's bright red and has a lot of potential, I thought it might be fun to use opti-red and see if we could preserve some of that fruit color. So let's take a look at what I did. Here is our lovely assortment of ingredients. I brought the strawberries out for this shot, but they're gonna go right back into the freezer until it's time to use them. I went with Welch's Natural Strawberry Preserves because I like the ingredients label. So let's get to mixing up this mead. First off, I'm gonna pour myself a quick drink and open our honey bucket. This here is alfalfa honey. I thought it would be a nice rich complement against the tartness and brightness of the strawberries. I'm just using a standard kitchen scale here to weigh out our honey, and then that honey is going to go right into the bottom of our carboy. And I had to do a couple rounds of measuring here to get it all measured out. And then we open all of our jars of jam. Now these came in plastic jars, which I'm not a big fan of because that's a lot of plastic waste, but if there's any way you can find to reuse them, reuse them. I put the jam in the microwave just for a few seconds to get it loosened up because it's kind of cool in my brew space, and so it had gelled pretty well. So about 15 seconds or so, just loosened it up from the sides so that way I could pour it into my funnel. And this jam poured pretty well once I got it loosened up and into the funnel. No big chunks or anything that blocked the funnel as I was pouring it in. And then I treated the other half of my jam just the same, get it loosened up, poured it in. And then I used some filtered water to clean out each of the jars, shaking and pouring and consolidating until I had all the remnants of the jam in those last 2 jars, so nothing was wasted. And then I added some pectic enzyme to help break down the pectin in the jam. We also added opti-red, which is a color preserver, in hopes we could get some nice red color out of this mead. So I weighed that out by package instruction and right in. And then measured out our 6 grams of wine tannin, just to give this a little bit of a nice soft tannin to kind of help sweep that strawberry flavor across the palate. And then I added a gallon of water just so I could get things loosened up a little bit more. And you can see it's got kind of a cool striation there, all the different layers separated out. We'll fix that with a little stir, stir, stir. So I just stirred it up to get everything mixed throughout nice and homogeneous. That way I can top it up and make sure everything is mixed well. And I took a gravity reading, which came in just shy of 1.11. We'll call that 1.098. And also in the interest of color preservation, we use this Premier Rouge red wine yeast, which should help us retain some of the color from the fruit. And we pitched the entire 5-gram packet right in. Give it a little bit of a shake and let it ride. I used a TOSNA 2.0 nutrient schedule for this, which basically meant that after 24 hours, I added a measured amount of Fermate-O to the mead, and then once I got to the 1/3 sugar break, I added 1 more addition of Fermate-O. This just makes sure that our yeast has a nice balanced diet during fermentation. So rather than gobble up all the nutrients right at the beginning of fermentation, it's kind of forced to eat a balanced diet over the course of the first week or so of primary fermentation. And this took a while to ferment, about a month or so to ferment all the way out to dry. But part of the recipe included adding frozen fruit near the end of primary. So I waited until my hydrometer hit 1.020, dumped my frozen strawberries into a brewing bucket, and then racked right on top of there. We should still have plenty of viable yeast in suspension, and those should be able to finish off fermentation. Which they did. In the course of 2 weeks, they obliterated those strawberries. So I racked it off to what is technically tertiary, but we're gonna call secondary. And then we let that clear for a while. Once it had cleared up pretty well, I went ahead and racked this off so we could get it sweetened. You can see there's a nice thick cake of sludge at the bottom, and we need to make room to add our sweetener. So I racked that off. And then we're adding 2 cups of a natural plant-based non-fermentable sweetener called erythritol. That means we can back sweeten without pasteurizing or stabilizing, and the yeast will not be able to eat this sweetener, so it will still be sweet at the end. Give that a bit of a gentle stir, stir, stir to make sure all the sugar mixes throughout. And then we'll cover that with an airlock and let it clear all the way. This took another couple of months to clear. And as you can see, it became crystal clear, so it was time to get that into bottles. I bottled here in 750 milliliter bottles and a couple of 12-ounce bottles, and got those corked and capped.
So as you can see, this was a relatively simple process, and mostly, more than anything, this took quite a bit more time than what I usually invest in a mead. You know, usually I'm doing more low gravity stuff or things that I'm finding to get cleared a lot faster, but I wanted to work with a few natural processes on here and kind of see how that treated this mead in a way that ensures that it's relatively accessible if anyone wants to duplicate my efforts. So we're gonna try this. When I bottled this up, it still had a little bit of what I would call a plasticky smell, which I actually associate with strawberry ferments. The one other time I had done a pure strawberry ferment, it smelled plasticky basically until I disposed of it. And so I was worried as I bottled this that this may be subject to the same fate. So in that regard, I would like to put out a warning here, or maybe a disclaimer, that I'm not going to ensure that this result is going to be repeatable if you try it, but I have faith that as this is sat and bottle aged, that it is going to have developed wonderfully. I hope. So I bottled this still. In our email exchange, Michele suggested that it might be really nice bottle conditioned. I opted not to do that because I really wanted to kind of go for that mead meets country fruit wine kind of crisp and refreshing kind of vibe. Here's hoping that I achieve that. So as you can see, color retention wasn't exactly as planned. In the carboy, as you may remember, when I bottled this, it was a nice rosy red, but that was because it was in a very high concentration, kind of like this blueberry mead here is. And whenever it's just in the glass by itself, it's got more of like a strawberry blonde kind of, almost rusty kind of tone. Still beautiful, just not that big, bold, punchy red that I was hoping for. Let's give it a go. On the nose, it smells like fresh chopped strawberries, like that aroma that you get as you're slicing through very cold, very crisp, very fresh strawberries. It's not jammy at all. You can pick up some of the acid from the strawberry in there. It's got a little bit of a zing to it on the nose, but I'm not picking up any of those kind of phenolic, plasticky notes that I was picking up on it at bottling. All of that has faded, and all I'm really getting here is kind of that fruity berry note and that fresh, bright acid note. Bottoms up. It probably could have been sweetened just a bit more. I might have gone with maybe an extra 500 grams, maybe doubling the erythritol, because as it is, it still tastes very wine-like. There's not a lot of honey character that's brought back in it. However, it's good. It's good in that kind of crisp, refreshing arbor mist kind of way, but I think if it was sweeter, particularly if it was stabilized and back sweetened with honey, it would have more of that jammy mead-like quality to it. It tastes exactly like a strawberry. Fresh and crisp. A lot of those fruity flavors are retained, and yet you pick up some of the tannin, that tannic flavor from the strawberry seeds. Kind of that flavor you get when you crunch up a strawberry seed in between your teeth. It's kind of interesting. It kind of feels like you're tasting the whole strawberry except for the greens on top. The mouthfeel is nice. It rides across your tongue. It's not watery at all. It's definitely not thin, and it does have a decent set of legs on it. It really kind of clings to the inside of the glass in a nice way. If the flavor you're going for is crisp, fresh strawberry, this nails it. If the flavor you're going for is mead, I would probably double the amount of sweetening that was done to this. However, as it is, it's quite refreshing. It tastes like strawberries, and I have a feeling that this will make a nice, delicate summer drink. Heck, you could maybe make sangria out of this. That could be nice. Or I'm even imagining like freezing it and making a slush out of it. It's really interesting. I'm happy to have done this. I think that there are some interesting notes to take away from this. Turning a country fruit wine recipe into a mead recipe is not as simple as it looks on the surface. For a first go, I think this is a perfectly lovely attempt at it. However, there are definitely things that I would change. Honestly, I'd probably add more fruit, maybe go into the range of 12 to 15 pounds of frozen strawberries. And if doing so, I'd probably back off on the wine tannin that was added to this. And like I said, in a future attempt, I'd probably stabilize and back sweeten this with honey instead of using the erythritol, because I think the richness and viscosity of the honey would really help give this more of a mead character. That said, I'm really pleased with it. So, experiment, sort of a success. I want to thank Michele for sending in her recipe. If you've got recipes that you'd like to see brewed or maybe altered in some way, I'm always happy to check out your emails. You can email us at dtm@doingthemost.org. And if you thought this video was interesting, I would really appreciate it if you hit subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that bell for notifications. We do a lot of homebrewing content here on the channel, so of course we'd be happy if you hung out with us. All the links for our social and everything else will be down in the description. Until next time, happy brewing and cheers.